Forget about Obamacare. Donate to Blood Care right now. Fix Jack Blood. Donate to jackblood@hotmail.com. For further information, go to jackblood@hotmail.com. Support Blood Care.
We don't need your education. We don't need your thought control. We don't need your education. We don't need your thought control.
Jack Blood. 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 Jack Blood.
I'll be back.
Warning. Whoa, guys. We're in a lot of trouble.
Attention. Warning.
Danger, Will Robinson. Danger, Will Robinson. Danger.
Remain calm. We will not tolerate civil disobedience.
Danger, Will Robinson. Danger.
Jack Blood. Jack Blood. Jack Blood. Jack Blood. Jack Blood. Jack Blood. Jack Blood is next.
I'll show you politics in America. Here it is, right here. I think the puppet on the right shares my beliefs. I think the puppet on the left is more to my liking. Hey, wait a minute. There's one guy holding up both puppets. Shut up. Go back to bed, America. Your government is in control. Watch this and get fat and stupid.
They say if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. But if you teach a man to fish, then he's got to get a fishing license, but he doesn't have any money. So he's going to get a job, and he has to get into the Social Security system and pay taxes.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. By the way, it's the same big club they use to beat you over the head with all day long, where they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy.
2, 1,
3, cue announcer. And starring the mad prophet of the airways,
Wake up! You're listening to the Jack Blood Show. Welcome aboard, DeadlineLive.info, RadioFreeBlood.com. With us today, a world-famous podcast master. That's right, he has a black belt in podcasting. He writes for the International Forecaster, Boiling Frogs, where he does a roundtable, and, of course, his own website, CorbettReport.com, where he puts some of the best weekly and bi-weekly and quad-weekly podcasts.
We'll do it.
James Corbett, welcome to the Jack Blood Show.
Thank you very much, Jack. Always a pleasure to be here.
Here's my first question today, and we're here in the end of May 2014. I don't know about you, but I've noticed that there's a lot of distraction politics going on for maybe the last month or two, and the big stories aren't getting printed, and it's a lot of distraction stories about sports teams and their racist owners. And I always get this, too, when I worked in the media before. There's this issue where there's no news in the summer, just go report, cooking stories about people cooking on the 4th of July and running through sprinklers. The issue would be, I guess, here that if there is no news, does that mean no news is happening? I get nervous when I see a lot of distraction politics.
As do I. I'm not sure that that's a particularly unique phenomenon to the time we're living in right now, but it is, I think you're exactly right. I mean, we've seen a lot of that kind of Donald Sterling type stories and what have you lately. So I also get a bit nervous because obviously that means there are things that are going unreported. And I guess we could talk about what's going unreported or underreported. But I don't know. I mean, I think some of these issues are actually bubbling up to the surface. And there's been obviously the Ukraine situation, the MSM starting to turn away from that because it's not quite going as smoothly as I think they wanted. But at any rate, it did at least make the news. And we had a bit of geopolitics in there and people got at least an inkling of what's shaping up. So I don't know, there's some bright spots out there in terms of perhaps people actually starting to tune into some real information. But as always, they're going to try to distract us with the crap that has nothing to do with reality as well.
Well, we expect that, and we always expected around the 4th of July, Dependence Day, as we've begun calling it years ago. Here in America, it's that's what people talk about, and forget about what happened to Flight 370. That just disappeared, and we're not to know what happened to it. And don't even ask any questions. When planes disappear, and it's the only thing in the news for months and months and months, and they never find a conclusion to it, Let's just not even ask them how that story ended, right? I mean, let's say we got a book, a really good book. Maybe it wasn't even a good book, and we read all the way through it, or we watched a movie, and the last 10 minutes is just like, nope, we're not doing it. We're not giving you that.
Well, actually, for people who've read something like Franz Kafka's The Castle, that's pretty much what happens. But yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I mean, that was an interesting story. I mean, that was clearly a psyop on a number of levels. And whatever actually happened to the plane, I think that the coverage of that was clearly part of the psyop. Whether intentionally so or whether it just became that, I'm not sure. But it was clearly a part of CNN's new strategy they're working on for how to cover these types of events. And it was ridiculous. I mean, it was patently ridiculous the way that they covered that ad nauseum, literally ad nauseum. And then finally, yeah, it's just, well, we never figured out what happened. All right, on to the next thing. So clearly, I mean, there was a number of levels of psyop going there, but I think probably part of it is just to see to what extent will the public accept that. And unfortunately, it looks like a lot of people will accept that without hardly blinking. So clearly there is something going on there. I think you're right. And it's just a part of the phenomenon of the age that we're living in. I think people are actually almost expecting these types of distractionary stories more so than they're expecting actual real reporting, to the extent that I don't know if people would understand real reporting if and when they saw it. And I mean, one way that we could look at that is something like the Benghazi incident, which continues to be in the news, but continues to be in the news for all the wrong reasons. Yeah. And in fact, you just had Alan West coming out and saying that he basically confirming, it was about gun running and Ambassador Stevens was.
They watched him die. They sat there and watched them all die. I mean, maybe they didn't watch maybe they didn't watch the Bin Laden killing, because we found out later that was fake, though they still tried to pass that off as real. You've got Hillary Clinton gasping, and then later she said she had allergies, and Obama sitting on the little boy chair. I mean, what a picture that was. But that didn't happen. On the other hand, the case you just mentioned did happen, Benghazi, but it is always in the news for the wrong reasons, and it's being politicked, from every different side. What's funny about
politicked being the key word,
isn't it? I know. Yeah. And Flight 370, it's still missing. It's the only major body plane that's ever gone missing forever, at least in recent memory, because people will quote these instances of planes missing, and they'll go, well, they didn't find it. Yeah, they found it in 3 days. It took them, 2 months to salvage it, but they still found it in like 5 days. This thing just completely disappeared off the map. And just to kind of bring it all home, so Obama is at the yearly press joke fest roast that they do every year here in America, where the president, does some stand-up humor, and everybody comes up and roasts him. And I thought he actually made a few poignant jokes. One was, he had to go to Malaysia to be covered by CNN, who was still covering Flight 370 at this time. But they're not covering it anymore. But this works on a whole nother level, because I was worried about this whole Bundy standoff, that they would wait till the media died down and go in there and get those people, as they've done in the past to others that have stood off against the federal government in the United States. But then I started thinking, you know what? People will just forget about it. The government's not going to lose face, James. The people will just forget about it, and it's like it almost didn't even happen.
And to some extent, I think they got what they needed out of that, because of the whole racism thing, and now it's completely, I mean, it just seems like the progressives who may have been potentially interested in a case, or at least listening to the details of a case like this, had their excuse to completely turn off and completely eschew anything to do with it. So there you go, kind of mission accomplished in that regard.
James Corbett on the broadcast with us today, the Corbett Report. And you and I, James, we never work out what we're going to talk about ahead of time, right?
I can attest to that.
I feel like the magician doing the show. Do I know you, sir? Have I ever met you before, sir? But it kind of all flows, because one of the things I wanted to get into, and I'm going to go back to your Ukraine comment here in just a second, but where we're going with this, we have to pay attention to it. Gary North wrote an article I thought that was really important and poignant, talking about how the Edward Snowden leaks are actually putting people to sleep, that it has this kind of information overload effect. So first we talked about no information getting out, right? Just complete, it's summer politics. There's nothing to report. There's nothing in the news. Distraction politics. Weapons of mass distraction in the mainstream media. But if you begin looking at everything Snowden does, I'm looking around at the people, and I get the feeling that they're done with it. They don't care anymore. Right now you can come out and say, give details of how you spied and killed little children or something, and it wouldn't matter almost at this point because it's completely desensitized people. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think you're right about that, and I thought the most interesting example of that in recent weeks was this whole brouhaha that happened when the Washington Post and the Intercept came out with their newest Snowden revelation, quote unquote, which was that there was this program that was collecting information on 5 nations, 2 of which was complete, total, 100%, every phone call, every email, the content as well as the metadata, absolutely everything. And the Washington Post, I think, withheld, I think, the identity of all of the 5 of the countries, and the Intercept identified 4 of them, including one of the 2 that were being completely intercepted, completely collected, which was the Bahamas, which is kind of strange because, of course, that has absolutely nothing to do with the war on terror, phony war on terror justification that they use for these surveillance programs. So that was interesting in and of itself, but the Intercept redacted the other country that they were collecting 100% on. So there was some brouhaha about that, and WikiLeaks was calling them out on it and saying, you can't redact this, we're going to release the information if you don't. And then the Intercept didn't, so WikiLeaks eventually came out and I think after 3 days and said it's Afghanistan and we know this, but we're not going to tell you how we know this. We have sources. So now there's all questions about, well, how does WikiLeaks? I mean, do they have the Snowden documents? Do they have some of them? How do they know this? Why did the Intercept redact this? Why did WikiLeaks call them out on it? All this stuff. But the interesting thing about all of that was that I saw the constant response from people out there on the net about this was not anything to do with that scandal itself, but simply, well, didn't we already know this? I mean, don't we know they're recording everything on everyone? And what about the U.S.? We know they're recording everything on everyone in the U.S. We have that from Russ Tice and the other NSA whistleblowers who've been talking about this. So why is this news? And to some extent, they're right. It isn't news. This is just another little tiny piece of the puzzle that they're building up here that eventually is going to be, oh, by the way, the NSA is recording everything. So it looks like people have jumped ahead on this story. So the people who actually care about it, I think, already assume that this is going on. And so they don't care. And then I think you're right. The kind of sheeple, or whatever you want to call them, the people who just don't generally tune in at all probably don't care at all. So it's had that dual effect, but it's also had another effect, which is interesting.
Well, I mean, hold on, go there. But if you just, again, jump in, if you dump something really important right now after a year plus of dumping this information, is anyone going to hear it? Is it the tree falling in the forest that no one heard?
Well, that isn't just a rhetorical question. Apparently, we're going to find out, because now the latest thing Greenwald's going around saying on his little book tour is that he's been deliberately holding back what he thinks, and Snowden apparently thinks, is the biggest of all the stories. And he said something like he figured it was like a fireworks show, and this is going to be the one that lights up the sky, or some silly analogy like that. So apparently he has been deliberately holding back the biggest story, and he said, I think he's going to reveal it in the next 2 to 3 months or something like along those lines. So we will find out, I guess, if there really is some massive major story, if people will react to it, or if they have been desensitized. But I just wanted to also add, I mean, this is important. Back in March, there was an actual scientific study that was co-authored with someone from MIT, and I mean, it was an actual peer-reviewed research paper that showed that there has been a 5% drop in search volume on, quote, privacy-sensitive terms since this started in mid-2013. And that includes both terms that have that could put people in trouble with the government, like pipe bomb and anthrax and things that you might expect, but also things that are personally sensitive, Viagra and gender reassignment and things like that. So there has been an effect in that regard that's actually documentable. We can actually point to it and say people are searching less for some of these types of terms than they were before these revelations.
You know, it kind of goes into the hopper of be careful what you wish for. You want the mainstream media to report things? Well, this is kind of how it goes. And if there is a huge Edward Snowden revelation, wouldn't it be wonderful if it came, I don't know, Super Bowl weekend? You know, I mean, that's kind of where we're going with this. And so the ultimate question, before I even get into and maybe even contradict myself, because there have been some new legislative developments in the United States regarding this NSA spying. But that's the question. Is it strengthening the NSA, in your opinion, or is it exposing them?
That is a good question. I don't think ultimately this is exposing them in a way that's going to fundamentally change anything. It's not going to fundamentally alter the structure of the intelligence apparatus that's been constructed. So I'm not expecting anything at this point. I'm not expecting anything major to develop from it. And that obviously brings up all the questions and associations with what was this leak all about and who's really behind it. And I think people out there probably who've been following my work probably know by now I'm not only extremely suspicious of Snowden and Greenwald, but really at this point I'm pretty much willing to say that it has been some type of allowed release. And I say that again in the knowledge that this is having that dual effect. First of all, that everyone basically expects that they're being watched right now, and secondly, that people are altering their behavior, which is exactly what we were saying at the very beginning of this. It's the revelation of the panopticon, and the panopticon is specifically designed to make people feel like they're being watched all the time so that they alter their behavior accordingly. That is exactly what's happening right now, so it's mission accomplished. And whatever legislative garbage reform, quote-unquote, they're going to throw out there, there's already been the articles talking about how the proposed legislation is actually going to allow them to spy even more, which, again, shouldn't be much of a surprise. But even so, even imagining that they come out with some sort of wonderful piece of legislation that puts all these legislative shackles on the NSA, why on earth would anyone believe anything they have to say at this point? They have outright lied to the public. They have kept many of these programs secret for years, operating behind the scenes. Why would we expect that if there was some new piece of legislation trying to pin them down, that it would alter anything? They already have the technological infrastructure in place to do this. So at this point, we would be naive to think they're not going to use that, whether or not they're legally allowed to. And so I think the whole reform idea is just complete, I don't know what to say, bollocks, I guess.
It is bollocks. Okay, so bullshite, horse hockey. But, seriously, I got to look at this because we still have to play the legislative game. I look at it differently than most of my peers do. I think we tell them what to do. We don't ask permission. They don't tell us what they're doing. We tell them what to do. We have enough consensus together that we could look at a bill. I know you covered this, Senate Bill 828 in California, 29-1. The California Senate passed a bill to pull the plug on illegal NSA spying. I've seen this kind of thing work with the NDAA, so I don't want to be that cynical that I just shoot it all down. But at the same time, I don't want to be railroaded. And I know that government is the problem. Government is the problem. Speaking of distractions in politics, we had Worldwide Monsanto Day yesterday.
Before we get into that, can I just add something really important to what you just said? Because you're right. I did just, for example, cover SB 828, and I am excited by the Nullify NSA ideas, because they are not, I don't see them as the type of reform legislation. These are things getting at what I just said, the technological infrastructure. And if states, especially, of course, Utah, but if other states as well, stop cooperating with the NSA and start to defund them and to stop them from using resources, water for cooling the servers and all of that, that's the way to get at that technological infrastructure that makes it impossible for them to do this. So I think that's why I'm excited by the Nullify the NSA campaign, not because it's not something we have to rely on just trusting them. Oh, well, they're not going to use this technology. It's that they can't use that technology if that's actually implemented.
So it's a stumbling block, and it makes it harder. And I actually believe that, the state senators, not our federal senators or federal congressmen, look at this and go, hey, they're spying on me and using it against me, and I need to, and I got to listen to my people because they're talking to me all the time. So I'm with you on this, and I'm glad that you said that. I mean, it makes it harder for them. So we'll give them that, but we can't just go to sleep at that point. And I was going to actually talk about this a little bit more with you, James, but the reason I brought up Worldwide Monsanto Day, just to kind of make the comparison that the end game here for the protesters is to get labeling, and they actually want federal labeling. I'd like state labeling or no labeling, and I got up and spoke at the Atlanta protest yesterday and said, look, I mean, this is a great step forward, but why shouldn't we just eradicate GMO if it's a problem? I mean, why do we settle for labeling?
Well, that's a good point because again, the GMO issue isn't just one of knowing what's in your food. I mean, that is an important step, and I'd rather have that than not have that. But the real point is exactly that this is an open air experiment with the genome of the planet that's being conducted, apparently whether we like it or not, and it's already infecting farmers' fields all around where these GMOs are planted. I mean, it's just a process of time before this starts to become, and perhaps it already has with certain crops, become just completely out of control to the point where they can't put that genie back in the bottle. So you're right. I mean, I think there has to be a different approach to the GMO issue. And again, myself personally, I actually, in some ways, am more not fearful, but I certainly more cynical about the idea of a federal labeling law, because that will be the type of thing that will allow people to turn off and go back to sleep. And we saw that in the California proposition, whatever it was, a couple of years ago, where they were voting on whether or not to put labeling laws in place. And the proposed legislation actually had it built in that there could be a certain percentage of GMO in those crops, or in any food product made from those crops, that would allow it still to be classified as non-GMO. So whatever that is, 2%, 3%, 5%.
And the FDA will figure that out. They'll be the regulators, and they'll figure that out. And if you pay them enough, or if, for instance, Michael Taylor, the FDA food czar, came from Monsanto, then obviously he's going to tilt the wheel, in the other direction. And I know that's why people are cynical, and that brings us to, I want to stay on the issue of the NSA. James Corbett with the Corbett Report. James Corbett with us, thecorbettreport.com. Congress passed a gutted bill beyond recognition, anti-NSA bill. Originally, the co-sponsor voted no on his own bill, and so we've got Justin Amash, who I think actually does a pretty good job, and he's one of the few somewhat good guys in Congress, and that's because you voted him in. You guys pushed really hard to get him in, and I think he takes that responsibility fairly seriously. He says, quote, "It's shameful that the President of the United States, the Chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and the leaders of the country's surveillance agencies refuse to accept consensus reforms," that's my thing, "that will keep our country safe while upholding the Constitution. This bill," he says, "mocks our system of government that they work to gut, and these key provisions out of the Freedom Act behind closed doors." Anything that says Freedom Act, I'm obviously very suspicious of. But at the same time, I have to look at it, James, and say, hey, man, at least they're voting on it. At least this is an issue. At least they're hearing consensus. And it's very easy for me to sit back here after all the work we've done and say, nope, I'm holding out. I'm a purist. I'm holding out for banning it. Just get rid of the NSA. Cut its head off. Something has to be done. So I'm looking at this as kind of a feeler, and I'm seeing the selected representatives of the United States of America feeling and hearing from their constituents. This is consensus, again, consensus reform, and we shouldn't be surprised that it was gutted. We shouldn't be surprised that it's not going to have the teeth that we need and might even work against us. But the fact that they're even taking it up, I think, is an issue, and I think one that we should, be happy about.
Well, I also don't want to be 100% cynical about what the people can do when they're actually motivated about an issue. And as an example of that, I'd look back to what happened last September with the whole Syria shenanigans that were going on, and the fact that we stepped back from the brink of some sort of outright military intervention. I think there were geopolitical reasons for that and other things going on behind the scenes, but at least part of it was because of the overwhelming opposition to that from the American public. You actually had people out on the streets. You actually had people contacting their congressmen, and it was being heard, and it did, I think, make a difference in the deliberations that were going on. So I think absolutely it is important not to just give up and say, the Illuminati controls everything and whatever they want is going to happen, because I think we have to. Once we reach that point, I mean, it's game over, because at that point we'll just allow them to do whatever they want. So I agree. We shouldn't be just throwing our hands up and saying nothing can happen. But I'm excited about those things specifically that can can actually make a difference. So, for example, when people are protesting the military intervention and military intervention doesn't happen, awesome, great, that's mission accomplished. And it's only one tiny, tiny part of a much bigger fight that's going on, but at least it was a victory we can point to. But when it comes to reform legislation that's being debated in Congress, I have a harder time getting behind that because, again, they've slipped all these clauses in through the back door that even allows even more to go on.
Yeah.
And then it also has the imprimatur of, well, this was debated. It was out in the public and Congress decided, the people have spoken, so now it's official. And it allows all of this stuff that people were against, and if you had told them a few years ago was happening, 99% of the public would have went, that's crazy, you're crazy, but if it was happening, I mean, that would be horrible, it would be the end of America. And it's coming to the point where they're going to put the official stamp on it and say, look, now it's all part of official policy, so now we can do it out in the open, or at least more so. So that's what I worry about this, is that it gives that kind of carte blanche for the government to do what it's been doing, but to do it in a more open way. And I think we have to try to avoid that. And the question is, how do you do that? I mean, that's what we're getting at. How do you effectively oppose this? And again, I don't think there's an easy answer to that because, as I say, this technological infrastructure exists, and I guarantee you they're going to use it. And they might not even tell you that they're going to use it, exactly like they used 9/11 as one of the sort of catalyzing events for them to go crazy with the illegal wiretapping programs, which we only found out about 5 years later after the New York Times finally decided that they would run the story that they'd been specifically sitting on for 1 year because they didn't want to jeopardize Bush's re-election campaign. I mean, just the craziness of what we've seen in the past decade and a half, to expect that anything we hear from Congress or the president is going to be truthful at this point, I mean, it's just pie in the sky thinking.
Well, where did the problem come from? It came from government. Government is almost telling you it's a problem and telling you they're going to provide a solution for it. It sounds like the Hegelian dialectic to me, James, and that's something, again, where we lose people. Because, for instance, if we're looking at the Freedom Act, which we covered long before it got voted on, and then after it got voted on, one of the things we wanted to warn people about is it reminded me of the Federal Reserve Act. You had the Aldrich plan opposing it, but they were really the same plans, you know? And so Senator Feinstein launched her own competing bill, which, of course, believe it or not, intended to codify, in other words, justify the NSA's unconstitutional practices in the law. So this is the thing. I mean, this is why it's very hard for people. Nobody wants this. They'll live with it if they have to. They'd defeat it right now if they could. But what we definitely don't want to do is to somehow codify this. And if you don't know what that means, folks, it means to justify it and set a precedent so that it can happen in the future because it's been voted on and the people all decided. And that's what Feinstein's law did. And so Amash's sponsorship of the Freedom Act, he didn't vote on it. He voted against his own bill. I mean, that just shows how bad it is. It shouldn't give us hope so much. Because it wasn't a good finished product. But it shows that we can get to them if we want to. So how do you propose, before we go to the next segment, James Corbett with us, how do you propose we stay on the ball here? How do you propose we get something, because I've worked in the legislative process, the media process, and all of these. It's very complicated. It's kind of like a war of attrition. How do you get the ball moving down the field, not backwards?
Well, again, there are basically two ideas or two approaches to this that I can actually get excited about. And one, as I say, is the nullify the NSA campaign, because I think, again, if that's effective, if that actually goes into existence, it will start to defund and basically dehead the snake, or whatever term you want to put on it. And again, I don't think that would be the end all and be all, because of course the intelligence apparatus is mostly beneath the surface. It's like an iceberg. So you might get rid of the what's on the surface, but it's the question of what's underneath. And so I think it would be naive to think that just getting rid of even if we got rid of the NSA in name, I mean, clearly its functions would go to other sections of government. So that's not a fight that would end at that point, but at least it would be a significant step forward. But I think the other approach, the other angle on this, is that this is not just something that comes from government. This is something that comes from us. this technology that is being used to spy on us, we have to remember we are the ones who buy it. We are the ones who put it in our pocket. We are the ones who carry it around all the time. We are the ones who have put ourselves right there in this panopticon, and now we're surprised that they're using it to spy on us. To a certain extent, we have to be the ones to either take the initiative to start setting up an alternative technological infrastructure, which can exist, and there are groups out there working on that and working on different technologies that that go around this system that's been constructed, or to actually think, you know what? Maybe we don't need these spy devices in our pockets 24/7. We didn't used to have this in our pockets 24/7. Why have we so completely bought onto this to the point where it is now possible to track us everywhere we go, everything we say, everyone we talk to? So to a certain extent, we have to take some responsibility for the construction of this because, again, no one's pointed a gun at your head to carry that spy device around in your pocket. So we have to start looking at the ways that we can detach ourselves from that system.
I was watching a weird movie today. I'm not even going to mention what it was, and the characters in it at some point, noted that they had, stopped being animals and had become civilized. And isn't that a problem? If I'm civilized, I have to have an electronic monitoring device with me at all times. And the fact that I had some of the first cell phones, James, and I haven't had them for more than a decade, makes me a weirdo. I mean, it's just really, you're not civilized if you don't do it, and you can't, play along in this so-called video game we call life. But on the same level, you're making the best point. Before we go to break, let's just drive this home. This is how you can do things without waiting on, billionaires in the Senate or whatever to vote for you or whatever it's going to be. And I heard of at our protest yesterday in Atlanta for the Monsanto March, there's a new app that tells you what's got GMO in it and what doesn't. Do we need to go to the government and create laws? How about if we all just snap into that? How about if there's a website that works much like eBay and says, here are the good corporations and here are the bad ones. Here's a good business and here are the bad ones. We already, have seen this. There's like rating systems for your local restaurants, and there's all kinds of Yelp and all kinds of pages that you can do this on. And I happen to really like this. I think it's really a good thing. And once one time that one corporation, if it's Nabisco or whatever giant multinational New World Order corporation, giant, Illuminati distribution, global corp cartel that it might be, is not being an honest broker and not being good for your community, then you just don't vote for him anymore. You just don't buy anything there anymore. And I wonder if we're going in that direction. And that's how I led my speech yesterday, James, here in Atlanta. I think we've won the global food revolution. We just need to, make sure to count the winnings because, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. And that's also very important. But solutions are where we're coming from. It's the Jack Blood Show. James Corbett, our good friend, is with us for his monthly. We'll be right back after this.
An explosive claim from the man who pulled off the biggest intelligence theft in American history. In his first U.S. television interview, Edward Snowden tells NBC's Brian Williams he was a bigger player than we've known.
Were you trained as a spy? It seems to me spies probably look a lot more like Ed Snowden and a lot less like James Bond these days.
Right, well, it's no secret that the U.S. tends to get more and better intelligence out of computers nowadays than they do out of people. I was trained as a spy in sort of the traditional sense of the word, in that I lived and worked undercover overseas, pretending to work in a job that I'm not, and even being assigned a name that was not mine. Now, the government might deny these things. They might frame it in certain ways and say, oh, well, he's a low-level analyst, to distract from the totality of my experience, which is that I've worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, undercover, overseas. I've worked for the National Security Agency, undercover, overseas, and I've worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency as a lecturer at the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy, where I developed sources and methods for keeping our information and people secure in the most hostile and dangerous environments around the world. So when they say I'm a low-level systems administrator, that I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd say it's somewhat misleading.
See, in my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda.
James Corbett is with us. The CorbettReport.com does an excellent job. People ask me, what radio shows do you listen to, Jack? And not a lot of them, but one of them I listen to is the James Corbett podcast at CorbettReport.com. Always great to have you, James, and I appreciate you being here.
Well, I appreciate that and the flattering words, and I'm going to return them not because I'm obligated to or not for any reason. I don't have any reason to kiss your behind, but Jack Blood Show is one of the few podcasts I'm subscribed to, so I right back at you. I really do appreciate the work you do.
We're going to tape that and loop it throughout the show. So I mentioned, we the theme, I guess, of our show today, our talk is distraction politics, so what's really going on? And I've noted so many troop movements in the last, couple of weeks around the world that it would take too long to even tell my listeners, but it's basically in every continent. And I know you're following this kind of thing as well. So if nothing's going on, why aren't we reporting on the troop movements in Africa, in Asia, in Eurasia, in South America, and even in America?
Why aren't we? That's a good question.
Well,
I'm just
pick out your favorite troop movement, because it's so hard to tell my listeners. There's 85 people going here. There's 350 going here. There's 100,000 going here. Z or Academy, or call them whatever you want. Blackwater is now working in the Ukraine. That's just a lot of show to do. But that's news. That's news that should be reported. That even, I guess we're slipping a little bit here, but when I was a kid or when I was a young man, you'd hear stuff like that on the news. Now you don't even know what's going on. So obviously something is going on. The troops are moving. You see them. I see them. What's going on with that?
Well, you are right that we only get the kind of bits and pieces here and there and have to piece them together. I wish there was a website that kind of comprehensively kept track of this, and maybe there is one. I just don't know of it. So it is kind of frustrating from that perspective. And obviously, here in Japan, I'm kind of interested in what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region, so I'm watching all of these maritime naval movements that are going on. And, of course, what's happening right now, as we speak, Maritime Cooperation 2014 between Russia and China. Gigantic naval drill taking place, and I believe up on the front page of Zero Hedge right now they have some pictures of what that exercise is looking like with some live fire exercises and the like. So that's pretty interesting. That's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on, but as you say, it's happening all around the globe right now. And I don't know if is it more kind of unusual movements and more things happening right now than normally happens, or is it just because we're noticing it? I don't know which phenomenon it is, but it seems to me that there really is a greater military buildup happening right now than I think anything we've seen since the end of the Cold War.
Nice. That's like a Heisenberg Theorem. We're affecting the experiment by watching it, I guess, but no, that's true because, look, we've lived in perpetual war for hundreds of years, and part of, what I cover, I do realize there's an aspect of it that there's more coverage than ever before. That doesn't mean there's more of it than ever before. There's just more coverage than ever before, even if it's underground coverage, right? So, sometimes we get a little heated because we start seeing things that we didn't see 10 years ago, but that's because we have a 24/7 news cycle and millions of different websites that are all digging into it to make sense of it. Again, I just want to go back to the suggestion you made. Where's the website that tracks all global troop movements? They'd be hacked so fast. There's no way they would be allowed to do that, and they'd be putting our troops in danger. It sounds like an episode of the New 24. Have you had a chance to watch the New 24? I wouldn't put that on you, so I'll tell you it's all about hacking and drones. Jack Bauer is back, and they're justifying that. At the same time, I think maybe sneaking out a few secrets, almost warning us.
To be honest, I've never even watched the original 24, so I certainly haven't seen the new one, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if that's the thing.
They're back. They're back, and it's under Obama. They have a very benign, nice president, and he doesn't like the drones, but they are effective. And how do we just get it through to the American people? We know you don't like this. We know you don't like the spying and everything, but it is effective. We're getting the terrorist. And if we could just, there's people that support Obama right now that say if they just knew what he had to get in his daily briefing every day, they would go along with all of this. This is what we have to deal with. in this, I guess, call it information perspective, right? I mean, because they do believe that. Although none of that is generally true, and it's all for a completely different issue. War is a racket. As we move to Memorial Day here, James, I mean, war is a racket. It's not a war to stop the terrorists, to protect us all from the terrorists. We haven't stopped anyone. There has been no stoppage. You can't cite one time where the FBI or the NSA or the CIA, I mean, where did they stop a terrorist attack? Just give it to them. But that's because they got Jack Bauer on the case. So I'm sorry I even brought that up, to be honest with you. You mentioned the Ukraine earlier, and I'm like mired in it, like a lot of people. I don't at this point even know what to report. It's so much back and forth. But the crux of the issue is there was a revolution, a very quick revolution there. The Western NATO powers filled the power vacuum. Russia is trying to fight their own fight for that power vacuum, and the citizens are caught in the middle. At one point, we had guys getting out of tanks and giving up and joining the towns that they were sent to blow up. I expect at some point to get this thing finished, and we have Bilderberg coming this week, which I want to get you to comment on, but at some point to get this thing finished, to solidify where the power vacuum ended up now, which is in NATO's hands, something has to happen, right? I mean, something bad has to happen so the whole world will get behind the NATO oversee of Kiev, of Ukraine. Have I pretty much got that right? Or, I mean, correct me when I'm wrong, because it's a constantly shifting story.
Well, you're right. I mean, it is difficult to know even what to cover anymore, because it is back and forth, and there's all these dramas and sub-dramas and sub-sub-dramas that are taking place, and so now it is kind of mired in confusion. There was a through thread, a narrative that they were obviously trying to push on this at the beginning. Whatever that narrative thread was, I think they've lost that thread, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to get it back at this point. So I think you're right. I mean, if we are looking at some sort of NATO complete takeover endgame of the entire country, it's going to have to involve some sort of pretty major incident between now and then. And I don't know if I see that coming. To be honest, I think that the most likely way that this whole Ukraine situation is going to play out is not in the Ukraine itself. I think that the real action is going to happen somewhere on the periphery, somewhere that people aren't really expecting. And again, that real action isn't necessarily going to be something that even looks like real action to people. But one example that we can at least tentatively point to is that there's been some interesting behavior coming out of some of the Central Asian states. For example, Kazakhstan was refusing to meet with, or at any rate, they didn't meet with Russia and some of the other CSTO members, which is the sort of NATO counterbalance or counterpart or whatever it is in that region recently, and they've been buddying up and cozying up to American officials, which is interesting for people who know about Kazakhstan and their position in all of this. Used to host a U.S. base that got taken away, and Russia has a base in there now, but maybe Kazakhstan's being swung the other way. So I think it might have to do more with the sort of the overall kind of balance of power that's happening right now with Russia and turning more to the east. And I think that's where perhaps this Ukraine story is going to end up, because again, it was never about the Ukrainian people or what's happening to the Ukraine. It was always about this fight over the power vacuum, as you state. So I think that in the end, it might not even be in Ukraine that we find the answers to what this whole Ukrainian operation is about.
Which sucks for the Ukrainian people, because this thing could drag out for quite some time and be a very low-burner Cold War, not even newsworthy lately, as I mentioned. Also in the news, and because you are covering the Asia quadrant of the New World Order, James Corbett with us, Pentagon press conference turned into a heated debate between top generals from the U.S. and China. Is this a dog and pony show? You know, there's territorial claims going on. In Japan, man, you are smack in the middle of this, and you'll be the first sacrificial lamb. I mean, already Thailand has been in play, and we've seen revolutions and color revolutions and fake revolutions and real revolutions going on there. I mean, it is just constantly in flux and in play, and pawns are being murdered as we speak. What do you think about this? I know you saw this story. I'm assuming that you did. That Beijing's generals, China's generals, and the United States generals are clashing at the same time. We're kind of in business together. How do you intricately tear that thing apart and make sense of it?
Well, I mean, the most interesting thing about all of this is something that even Mark Faber was pointing out just recently on Bloomberg. He did an interview where he's pointing out that at some point the U.S. is going to have to back off because China is so now integral not only to the world economy but specifically to the U.S. economy that they don't have the leverage that they would have had at a different point. I mean, we really have seen the end of the unipolar American empire-led world, and it's just a question of people realizing that fact at this point. But I don't think that they can actually effectively oppose China in the way that they would have been able to even 5 or 10 years ago. And I don't mean that militarily. Obviously, if it came down to a shooting match at this point, again, China is upgrading, but there's no comparison that America would be able to clean their clocks very quickly militarily. But it's the economic aspects of this, the international financial architecture that's now been constructed around China and Russia to some extent, and some of these other countries that they're trying to build into this, second competing power block, is becoming a real threat in economically speaking, and so I don't know how to read this, because everything that I see points to the fact that I don't think either side actually wants a hot shooting war at this point. I don't think that works for either side in this conflict, which is why I'm looking more at the obviously the kind of growing chatter and boiling points of tensions and big diplomatic statements and big bold moves that are happening as more of the part of the ratcheting up of tensions, which they use to sell the arms contracts to the public. Oh, well, we have to go in there with these billion-dollar drone deals to Korea and all of these other things that are being sold right now to Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, and all the usual cast of characters are in there lobbying hard. I have to see that as being a fundamental part of what's going on right now. And if and when there actually comes to the point at which, China is trying to take the Senkaku Islands from Japan or whatever, however that plays out, I think that's the point at which the bets are off the table and, World War III is here. I would think so, at any rate. I think that would be kind of a major catalyst. But again, I'm not sure either side wants that or could even effectively do that at this point.
Well, isn't that the same with Russia, too? Look, I mean, this is, John Perkins was right. This is all about economic warfare and less about strategic or, on-the-ground warfare. And I think the rest of that is almost just consumption for the noobs. I mean, you can't blow up. Well, I don't know. I mean, if I talk to Paul Craig Roberts, he thinks we can blow up China and Russia, that there's crazy people enough that might try to get away with that, a decapitating strike. And I have to think that they're hearing that same chatter, really, and that the egos could, all of a sudden clash and something could blow up. But at the same time, what we're talking about is globalism and global monopoly. And everything I analyze, James, I put it through that. How does this affect the global growing monopoly of which, we know who the players are? So, blowing things up and sending out bombs and the bombers and nuclear warfare and World War III, it's just not very predictable, though these are negotiating tactics. At the table. Speaking of which, Bilderberg 2014, I guess it's in Copenhagen. We're going to be doing coverage on our show this week about it and next week. Any indicators? I look at this now the last few years, I got to be honest with you. I'm an honest person, and I just say what I think. It's like become the conspiracy red carpet. It's become like the fashion awards for alternative media, and I'm getting less information every year about what's going on, and it's becoming less important to me every year for some reason as I watch how the pieces are moved from Davos or at the Clinton Global Initiative, and I just see, all these other conferences that seem to be more influential and more important. Yes, there is a Bilderberg. It does exist. We can all admit that now, but is this anything more than just kind of a bait and switch, a dog and pony show? Does this mean anything anymore? What is your impression of Bilderberg 2014? We're coming on it now.
I hear what you're saying, and I have to admit, in recent years, I've been thinking similar things. And I did a podcast episode last year about Beyond Bilderberg, trying to point out the fact, yes, Bilderberg's big, it happens, there's these important people that meet there, and I'm glad that it's been exposed, but we shouldn't just, this isn't the be-all and end-all. This is not the only conference. This is not the only way that these people get together or could get together if they wanted to. So why do we concentrate on it as if that's the case? And really, to me, the proof is in the pudding. If there are predictions or things that are coming out, people with inside sources or what have you, who are getting information that actually tells us about what's going to happen in the next 12 months, then yes, it is important, and we should be covering it to that extent. But if that doesn't happen, then obviously there's something missing in our reportage there.
Well, how about this? If we're only covering rhetoric and hyperbole coming from bullhorns and from ceremonies and protests and pictures into people's limousines, if that's all we're covering, they've won. They beat us on this.
I understand what you're saying. I agree in some respects. In other respects, I say it's important to show people that there is resistance. Again, I don't want to be down on that idea. I think we do.
I'm not saying that either. I know, but at the same point, it's become, the last few years has become more about the ceremony of the Bilderberg conference itself than it has about the actual nut and bolts issues that we can find out that they might be discussing.
Exactly right. And now, now they do have BilderbergMeetings.org, and I see that they don't have the agenda or anything up about this year's meeting yet, so, we'll have to keep our eye on that. But that is important. What are they actually talking about, and what are they actually saying is much more important than just the fact that there are protests going on, and I agree with you on that. And we can look back to, I think it was 2003 when Jim Tucker was reporting, they're going to crash the price of oil. Everyone at that point was thinking it's going to go through the roof, it's going to hit $200. And he says, no, it's going to go down. They're going to crash the price. And he was actually right, as opposed to pretty much every other analyst at the time. That was important. 2006, Daniel Estulin on camera saying they're going to crash the housing market. This is going to be part of the new global financial infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. And everyone on the talking head media at that time were saying, that's crazy. Housing bubble is forever. This is different. New economy. And of course, next year it did crash. So those are important points that we can look back and say some actual information came out. But in recent years, what have we gotten? I remember a few years ago there was a big story about how the Bilderbergs were talking about how they have to assassinate Ron Paul or something, and that became a big story for, a week or whatever it was before it was completely forgotten about. I think we have to actually critically look at the information that's supposedly coming out from these inside sources, and do they have any bearing to reality?
Yeah, hey,
or
there's
are they
that.
Just sort of stories that are just being used to generate
we're
readers?
so desperate now to get something that, listen, James, I would be so much more popular and make so much more money if I just wrote fiction and put it on my radio show. Who would question me? That's the thing. And that's, what I love about your work is that you run it all through the hopper several times and you strain out the gold, and that's what you get with the Corbett Report. James Corbett, thecorbettreport.com. It's great talking to you every month. Thank you so much for making time for the Jack Blood Show. Anything you want to put on the record before you go?
Nothing at this time. Just let me call for people in your audience to support the work that you're doing, because I know you're too bashful to do it yourself. But once again, people, if you don't support the work, it's not going to come. So get on Jack's site and donate a few dollars.
No, I'm not bashful. The truth is, I just want them not to support me so I can go do something else and live a normal life. That will be my excuse. So I do warn you, I don't have to do this. If you don't like it and don't support it, I'll take that as an omen. However, support my friend James Corbett. $1 a month, I think it is, gets you on his multiple mailing lists. And James, you work on so many fronts. It's almost amazing we could even get you once a month now. And I'm glad that you still make the time for us and still, honor, the people that we can reach. And I do appreciate that. But support James or he goes away. Support Jack Blood or he goes away. And that's where it really comes down to. Or we can let Congress vote on who should be the radio shows. And then we'll do it like that. All right, my friend, best to you and your family and everybody you know there in Japan. And we'll talk to you next month. It's the Corbett Report. Stay bold, brother.
All right, take care, Jack.
And that brings us to an end of another Jack Blood podcast. Check out all of our archives going back 13, 15 years at deadlinelive.info. Deadlinelive.info. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter and radiofreeblood.com. Don't forget to support our good friend James Corbett at corbettreport.com. And right now, You can heal me. You can fix Jack Blood. I need some fixing, and I'm not going to Obamacare. I need some blood care. Please donate to the show. Support my cause, which is fixing me, getting me better so I can continue to do podcasts just like this. Write to jackblood@hotmail.com, jackblood@hotmail.com, or send your donation there through electronic e-pay payment, and you'll get some karma, and you'll fix me. Blood care.